You're listening to The Pipeline, the Western Standards National Affairs program, recording this Sunday, April 19th, 2020. Each week, we break down the issues, discuss them in depth, and examine some of the broader implications for Western Canada and beyond. Featuring from Calgary, the Western Standards publisher, Derek Fildebrandt. Good day, Derek. How are you?
Fine.
Fine. Okay.
Fine. It's not freezing. That's nice.
Excellent. Featuring also Dave Naylor from Calgary, the news editor of the Western Standard. How are you doing today, Dave?
I'm doing great, Paul. Thank you.
Would you say better than Derek?
No, not better than Derek.
Okay. And also featuring from Strathmore, Deirdre Mitchell-MacLean, our senior reporter at the Western Standard. How are you, Deirdre?
Fabulous.
Better than Dave and Derek, by the sounds of it.
Mm-hmm.
Outstanding.
Sunshine.
Now you're just showing off.
And I'm your host, Paul Holmes, digital editor here. And without further ado, we'll get underway. Some of the topics we'll be talking about on the pipeline today are Keystone XL, the very latest news on that. The tendency of people to rally around the leader in times of crisis. When is the economy going to open again? And are leaders bound by the same rules that the rest of us are bound by in a crisis? And finally, hairstyles for the apocalypse. But we'll begin with Keystone XL. Who broke the story? Was that Dave or Deirdre that broke that one? I didn't catch the title.
Which part of it?
It depends what part you're talking about, Paul.
All right, well, why don't we go around the horn then? Who wants to go first?
I'll go first. I'll jump in first.
Okay.
There was much public ballyhoo a couple of weeks ago when Jason Kenney announced a multi-billion-dollar infusion into the Keystone XL. And things were going along merrily for a couple of days until it got into the courtroom in Montana, where a judge put up his hand and put the whole thing on hold. He's told the Army Corps of Engineers that they've got to stop digging the big ditch and go back and redo a study on wildlife in jeopardy or something like that. So all the money in the world doesn't get you a completed pipeline at the moment.
Deirdre, what can you tell us?
That was on Wednesday. Oh, that was the 31st? No, that was on April, the day before Kenny's 1 year. So yes, April 15th. And TC Energy actually had a hearing scheduled with the federal court in Montana about a 2018 order, actually from the same judge. So this is a new order that I'm not sure if they can discuss that at the hearing or not, or if it was, I guess you could say, yet another stall tactic that's going to hold them up for another couple of years while they wait to get in front of a federal judge on this new order.
Well, it seems like even in a pandemic, we can't seem to build a pipeline in North America, or certainly this side of the border, connecting with the other side of the border. Derek, what are your thoughts?
Well, a lot of the commentary around this has been the usual hypocrisy. Conservatives are supposed to be against corporate welfare, except for when it's industries that they like oil. I think pretty broadly, it's fair to say the Western Standard is about as pro-oil as you can get. But we've gotten to this strange point in Canada where certain industries are left-wing and other industries are right-wing. Oil is a right-wing thing. Solar panels and airplanes are a left-wing thing. So conservatives always wring their hands when Bombardier gets government money, rightfully so, because we're throwing good money after bad, government picking winners and losers in the private sector. But when we start throwing billions of taxpayers' dollars into industries that are traditionally associated with conservatives, there's no problem. And then the left, all of a sudden, which has no problem with subsidies for GM, Chrysler, Bombardier, they scream bloody murder when subsidies go to an industry that they don't like. But the economics are no different in either case. It's a case of government taking taxpayers' money out of profitable businesses in the private sector and investing it into businesses that they see fit. Now, Keystone needs to get built. It's actually, even though it gets far less attention in the press than Trans Mountain, it's more important than Trans Mountain. It's taking us not just to foreign markets, but to heavy oil refining capacity, which is far below capacity right now on the U.S. Gulf Coast, especially since Venezuela, despite having the second largest reserve in the world, can't seem to produce oil very well. And that'll eventually get us to international markets once that oil is refined there. So this is actually the most important pipeline to get built, but it doesn't need taxpayers' money. Once Trump was elected and Obama's veto was gone and Clinton's promised veto was out of the way, the political hurdles were really gone. It's going to run into court battles as it is now. But I think having, from America's perspective, a foreign government taking a large ownership portion of this changes the political dynamics. This is no longer, in the American debate, a debate around private businesses versus some of the more radical environmental movement. It's now, we've made the Alberta government, from their perspective, a foreign government, a direct player in this. A lot of legal experts think that this actually hurts a lot of the cases in court because this is not American citizens via corporations they're dealing with now. They're now dealing effectively with a foreign government. So this really blew back in our faces here. It's a massive amount of money. And we're really now getting very comfortable with government owning the means of production. This is something that should scare anyone who is supposed to theoretically support free enterprise. But we're now perfectly okay with Ottawa owning in its entirety the Trans Mountain pipeline, and the Alberta government owning in large measure the Keystone pipeline. And it's nothing less than government owning the means of production. And if anyone else besides conservatives does it, you call that socialism.
Yeah, there's definitely a principle to be stated. You know, either you believe in corporate welfare or state-owned enterprises, or you don't. It's striking to me, and certainly, maybe, you know, even in a time like this, there's going to be exceptions, but they should be exceptions, not the rule. If you believe in the principle, and so you know, I've always found that you know, amongst the tribalist world that we live in today, you know, that, you know, it's okay if my side does it, but not okay if your side does it, really loses any weight in the argument, in my opinion. Any further thoughts on Keystone XL, Dave or Deirdre?
I think it's also important to mention what's going on in the States with their oil production right now. And recently, the Trump administration lost a Senate vote to be able to get $3 billion to purchase more of American produced oil for their reserves. And so now they're looking at a package, so to speak, to be able to pay their shale oil producers in the US to actually leave it in the ground to effectively stop it from accruing additional supply, because that's going to keep, of course, the price down. So with this also going on, and yes, Canadian crude is not the same as US shale oil, it's completely different weight, yada, yada. But Line 3 also will be completed this year. The American leg of it, the last court hurdle that they had was they managed through that in February. So that will also come online this year. You know, the Keystone leg that they're looking at right now, it's effectively a shortcut to the existing Keystone pipeline. So the existing one goes from Alberta over to Montana and then comes down south. This one just kind of cuts across diagonally. So, you know, is this beneficial? Yes. Is it, like, are they in desperate need for it? In the current environment, I'm not sure that they are.
Well, I guess that really underlines. I was reading, I don't know, this was a couple weeks ago now, but I was reading that oil reserves were increasing rapidly all around the world as consumption has gone down, and they're going to run out of places to store it all if the consumption doesn't resume. So I don't know. I don't know how much that changes week to week or how accurate that is, but
jerry cans. The answer is more jerry cans.
Hey, quick trivia question: how many gallons in a barrel of oil? You guys, come on! You're from Alberta. You don't know this? I actually learned this.
Gallons are for
I don't
weird
buy
foreigners.
it by the gallon.
All right,
Or, sorry, by the barrel.
How many liters then? Nobody? All right. You can put your comments about us not knowing that in the comments below.
Shame on you, Paul, for asking a question that sounds like we should know the answer to, but we're supposed to discuss this in advance so we can prep it and look smart and Google it.
Oh, no way.
What is the answer?
Oh, I can't remember. It's like 44 or something.
BC folks.
All right, good times. So one of the phenomenons, and it's funny. I get, I kind of have my, I have my political bent, as we all do, and so there's certain politicians I like better than other certain politicians. So I can go on to Twitter and talk about how the popularity of the politicians that I like is way up, and then I hear about the popularity of the politicians I don't like also being way up, and I realized actually they're all up pretty much, with a couple of notable exceptions. One of which is Jason Kenney in Alberta, which we talked about before the show, may well have just been on the way down anyway. But, as the honeymoon, I guess, expired and reality set in. But why don't we talk about Jason first? Why is he the outlier in terms of popularity? And then let's talk about this general trend in the world of people rallying around leaders in a time of crisis. So who wants to talk about Jason Kenney first?
I want to hear what Derek has to say.
All right, Derek, we're going to start off with you.
Well, I think it's just human nature that in times of crisis, you look to leaders, whoever's in place, to provide comfort and reassurance. People don't know what to do. Maybe even more so today in an age where there's so much information out there and so little of it, and so much of it can't be trusted or verified. But this will happen in wartime, in pandemics, in natural disaster. In almost every big disaster, the local leader, if they're following the script, will go up in popularity. Naheed Nenchi's popularity went from decent to through the roof during the 2013 floods in Calgary. Came back down significantly afterwards, but it gave him a huge bump. Even Alison Redford. I remember progressive conservatives going around at the time saying Alison Redford was going to govern as queen forever. And 1 year later, she's gone. But so it's a natural phenomenon across Canada. The leader making, I think getting the biggest pat on the back is Doug Ford, who's really emerged. I'm watching old Liberal friends of mine in Ontario who, considered him just literally Hitler months ago. Many of them are grudgingly saying he's doing a good job.
I've seen that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been something. So almost all the premiers are up across the polls in their own approval. The exception is here in Alberta, but as was alluded to, and I think Dave said before we got on the air here, I think this is just actually his honeymoon coming down. I think he's actually handled this crisis reasonably well. One thing most people don't understand is in a crisis, if you're not Donald Trump, the bureaucrats are actually in charge. Most of the politicians, they're just doing what the bureaucrats tell them to do, and they follow a script. And if they do that, things normally go mostly well. Rachel Notley during the Fort McMurray fires, her popularity went up. She was, considered to do reasonably well. But in most cases, they're just following the orders of these pre-written plans as the bureaucrats are in charge. I think Kenney's handled it at least no worse than the average Canadian premier. But I think we're just kind of seeing that the honeymoon is over. I think he was running into some difficulty on other fronts, and all this fair deal stuff we haven't had any results whatsoever yet. And so a lot of this stuff, I think, is just the shine coming off the government, not necessarily related to the pandemic.
Leaving Deirdre till last because we're all interested in what she's got to say. It doesn't help Kenney, and I agree with Derek that I think Kenney's done as well as any premier across the country. It doesn't help Kenney when he's getting daily tweets from the opposition, from Rachel Notley. And it's just negative repeated, repeatedly over and over and over again, day after day after day, on what a crappy job Kenney's doing. He also made the mistake of taking on doctors before he knew a pandemic was going to hit. So the opposition is now using that on him. I mean, what sort of premier would take on heroic doctors when they're saving us from the pandemic? So it's. I haven't seen opposition in other provinces act up as much as the NDP is here in Alberta, but that's obviously one of the reasons Kenney's popularity is sinking.
Yeah, but before Deirdre jumps in, I think Dave was bang on there. I didn't mention the doctors. They had been already entering a labor dispute with doctors before this hit. Yep. It was really crappy political timing, and they can't be blamed. I think they were actually making some reasonable and very modest changes with some of the pay scale around doctors. But it hit at a pretty poor time when doctors moved to the front of everyone's mind, and that gave them massive leverage, forcing them to back down. And at the same time, while in most provinces and federally, the oppositions have been much more careful and measured in their criticisms of government, the NDP are still acting like it's question period every day here. And while that it might be a bit crass, they've continued hammering on, and I guess among their supporters and some middle voters, that's chipping away.
Deirdre.
I'm just allowing the apologists to wash over me here.
Sorry, are you? I'm a Jason Kenney apologist?
Apparently.
I'm a rational critic as opposed to the crazy critics.
Despite the poor Jason Kenney's honeymoon is over, and poor Jason Kenney getting hammered by the opposition, and that's just tearing him down in conservative Alberta. I would honestly say that it's simpler than that. Simplest explanation, which is Jason Kenney was elected to bring in jobs, economy, and pipelines. None of that is happening right now. And we've got a health pandemic. And while as Derek may say, it's perfectly reasonable to cut doctors' billing amounts and things like that, and restrict them from providing services that the government can outsource to private companies like TELUS. This isn't why he was elected. He wasn't elected to do this, to handle this. And, whether you can say, I think he's done as reasonably well, sure. But that's not what anyone wanted from him. And I don't think he's the trusted individual that people are looking to for information in this pandemic. And I will say as well, Doug Ford absolutely has done, he's been the surprise leader throughout all of this. And I think one of the reasons why is because Doug Ford is no longer cutting services for vulnerable people. So, he's actually changed his tune. Jason Kenney is still providing economic updates during our COVID updates. So, there's no change in the tune there.
Well, I can't take credit for this thought, but I read an interesting piece about a week or two ago about different leadership styles. And there are your managerial peacetime leaders who are sort of a steady as she goes type leader. And then there are your break glass in case of emergency wartime style leaders. There's a reason that no one really wanted Winston Churchill to be the Prime Minister of Britain in peacetime, but everybody knew he was the right guy in wartime. And what we're finding is maybe this is the application of different leadership styles. Doug Ford is a rock the boat, anti-establishment kind of guy. And those people have a very difficult time in normalcy and peacetime. But when shit hits the fan, they're the guy. And so Doug Ford's leadership style shines through at a time like this. But when the crisis is over, there's a good chance that people will not like his leadership style anymore because he is a rock the boat, emergency style leader. Kenney, I think, is very much the opposite of Doug Ford in a style. He is a methodical, calculating, long-term thinking leader who really doesn't know what to do in a crisis. He doesn't inspire people in these kinds of times. And so it's different kinds of leadership styles coming forward at different times. I'm not sure what kind of leader Justin Trudeau is. I think he's I won't even speculate. I haven't seen him shine in either time.
I think Justin Trudeau just is the talking head for the smarter people in the room, but that's just one guy's
Yes,
opinion.
that's the third style. There's the puppet leader.
Just to Deirdre's point, Deirdre, you mentioned, and I don't want to misquote you or paraphrase too wrongly, but, he essentially wasn't elected, to be the guy to lead us in a pandemic. But neither was anybody else. And yet still we see a very different result. People, when they elected their leaders elsewhere, had high expectations about a very different agenda than leading through a pandemic. And yet, everywhere else we're seeing this trend where people are rallying around the leaders, but it's really not happening. Do you think there's some merit to what Derek's saying around maybe just the leadership style, or is there something unique about Alberta?
It could also be that Jason Kenney he's sticking to his pre-pandemic message, right? He's still talking about jobs, economy, pipelines. And that's fantastic. It's still important, but more and more people, like I'm starting to see on my Facebook is very conservative because I grew up in rural Alberta. That's the groups that I really have on Facebook. Also probably why I don't spend much time on there. But I'm starting to see a lot more in my feeds of people getting really annoyed. They don't want to hear Jason Kenney's economic update when they tune in for Dr. Hinshaw's COVID update. So, and I mean, I get right irate because I'm ready for the COVID update, right? I'm not prepped to, Jason Kenney's talking about the economy too. That's a totally different story and doesn't belong in the same, I don't know. And so maybe it's his refusal to change message.
Well, maybe this is a good transition because we're talking about reopening in the economy now from COVID.
Well, if you don't mind,
that's a good transition.
It is a good transition, but I did want to just bring up one other quick thing talking about leaders, and that is this cult sort of leadership around, because Derek, you had mentioned bureaucrats really being in charge, and we're seeing this kind of almost cult-like reaction to the public health officials and their role. We're seeing, murals of Dr. Tam and Dr. Henry here in British Columbia, and people just, heaping praise upon these people in a much bigger way than we're seeing for the politicians. And I'm wondering if that's part of the same phenomenon, or is there something more to that? If anybody else has any other thoughts, it's just an observation of mine.
I think it's a good point. What the? Oh my goodness. So Dr. Hinshaw or Henshaw, she's become a bit of an emergent folk hero. No one had heard of her outside of maybe one square block around the headquarters of AHS in Alberta. No one had heard of her before. She's become a bit of a folk hero. Now she's got stylized billboards of people putting up her image around. She's really done well. There was quite a bit of blowback against Jason Kenney when he gave he disclosed the province's modeling. He was clearly out of he's a guy who reads his briefs. He's not a dummy, but clearly modeling around a pandemic is far outside of his depth. It's even outside of the depth of an experienced health minister. It's clearly the job of public health officials like Dr. Hinshaw to go through, and he did it himself. Some would say maybe just to get more airtime and look like that leader. When people were like, well, put the doctor on who actually understands this stuff, isn't just reading the script. So there was some blowback there. I think that is probably his biggest misstep through this so far. Doug Ford, to the best of my knowledge, hasn't bothered with doing that kind of thing. Where he's been different is out there physically doing things for the camera, showing that kind of hands-on, everyman kind of leadership that you'd expect from him. But yeah, these public health officials across the country have been really become the folk heroes of this, except for Dr. Tam. I think there's a big difference there. Maybe Dave can expand on it, but I think she's been viewed very differently than, say, public health officials provincially in Alberta and BC.
I was just going to bring that up, Derek. Dr. Tam started well. She seemed to get that sort of cult following, and then it's just been one blunder after another blunder after another blunder. From, okay, don't wear face masks. Okay, go ahead, wear face masks. She doesn't seem to have the trust anymore that Dr. Dina would have, or a BC doctor would have. And I think it's mainly because it's almost like she's being linked with the Trudeau government. She's almost an official spokesperson for the Trudeau government, and doesn't have our own best interests at heart.
Well, and I wonder, and I've wondered this from the very beginning, and maybe I just don't understand it, but my thought, what I thought a public health official is supposed to do is that they're supposed to be as tuned in to public health threats as possible. They should be doctors and scientists and epidemiologists and all the like, and that their job is to take the best information they can and then make recommendations to the politicians, not worrying about all of the other political concerns that could exist. And then it was the job of the politicians then to take that advice from the public health officials and then come up with the official public policy. And I thought that's how that was supposed to work. And my big complaint from several weeks ago, frankly, and I think it's gotten better, but I remember Dr. Henry here in the province of British Columbia. I'm locked at home already because I saw what was coming, and I'm like, no way, I'm not going anywhere. And she's on television telling people to go out to restaurants and go to Whistler for the weekend. And I'm thinking to myself, why is a public health official on the eve of a potentially devastating pandemic suggesting to people to go to Whistler or to go out to restaurants? And the best I can come up with is that she was evaluating it politically, thinking, oh, well, there could be damage to the economy. She shouldn't be concerned about the economy. She should be concerned about public health. Let the politicians be concerned about the balancing act between the economy and public health. That's what I think.
Well, and that's why Tam has suffered in reputation relative to the other provincial public health officials. She's been an apologist for the Chinese government, which is very much parroting the political line of the Trudeau Liberal government, which is very, very close with China. And, so today, now you've got France, Germany, UK are now launching potential class action lawsuits against China for its absolute bunglingness from start to finish. And Tam is sitting there as an apologist for it, which sounds very political. So she has now become a polarizing figure right down there with the politicians, whereas the provincial health officials, at least the ones that I've seen, have seemed to be above this and have been the straight goods, giving people what at least appears to be relatively honest information.
Deirdre, you've been cautiously silent. Unusually.
Yeah. I would, I think it depends on what end of the country that you live on, because she seems to still have maintained support in other areas of the country. It's been very difficult to watch a lot of this unfold, to listen to the public health officials, the politicians, and to see the blowback, especially that our public health officials are getting for things like, no, a mask isn't going to help you, to wear a mask, understand though it really doesn't help you if you are healthy. It wasn't really a 180 on sure, wear a mask. It came with the caveat of, if you're sick, that can help, protect other people. But if you're healthy, the type of mask that you can buy in your local store isn't going to be the proper mask that you need to keep particles out. So I think there's been a I think there's been a lot of blowback during the learning portion. And the thing is, we're not going to know everything about this virus for a while yet. And the thing is that, even Deborah Birx out of the States, she was saying that looking at China's numbers before it got out, she said that it wasn't a worry for them either. They weren't worried about it. Why? Because it looked kind of like SARS did. I mean, SARS got into Canada, was in Toronto, and they contained it, right? They were able to work with that. So I think it's evolving information. It's just evolving information. It is changing. It's changing because they're learning more about it. The fact that we're getting different information
But the
today.
one thing we knew from the very beginning is it came from China. And on her recommendation, that they barely even restricted travel from China for people who are at risk. I mean, it's absolutely mind-boggling that we were too chicken shit to put in any travel.
And it's because Trump put the travel restrictions in place. Trump put his travel restrictions in place. The blowback was, "Oh, you're just being a racist as usual."
So where did Americans go?
Doing that.
Did Americans get dropped off in Canada instead and then cross the border by car? I'm just curious because I have a feeling those Americans still got back home. That was the big reason why.
People is one thing, but bringing in nationals
visitors
from other countries is a big difference. And
that was the
out there from the beginning saying China didn't do anything wrong here. Their response was reasonable, and I think just a lot of this is this government's very close relationship with the Chinese mainland.
We're kind of reliant on them right now.
Sorry, Doug. China is no doubt the bully or the bad guy in this whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Don't forget, Justin Trudeau just 3 weeks ago gave that same lab in Wuhan more than $800,000.
No. They're part of a group.
Of a study, part of a group. But
yes,
it is
part of a group of individuals.
The exact same lab that let this virus out. And
that hasn't been proven.
Oh, Deirdre, come on.
Come on.
Dave, I thought you were a hard news guy. I thought you were a hard news guy.
All the intelligence right
allegedly
now is okay. I'll use the word allegedly.
Thank you.
Good
journalist.
It was being dealt with in this lab, and a lab worker took it out, gave it to her boyfriend, and then they went for dinner at the Bat House down in
where they ate anteaters.
That's where it started. She's patient zero. And I just hope Trump follows up on his vow that if China doesn't clean up their act, that he's going to come down hard on them.
Well, I'm glad we can all agree that China's at fault.
Yeah,
except for Deirdre.
We do.
Except for the commies.
Oh dear God. Anyways, the thing is, China will very likely
we need to kind of
sanctions.
We've been on this topic for a while, so maybe Deirdre, you wrap up. But we have to, I think, move along here. So why don't you wrap up, Deirdre?
Holy crap. Okay, so
the Chinese
stop talking. If everyone else stops talking, I can wrap it up. So China will very likely receive sanctions. I think that's been a really interesting conversation to see. I don't think anyone's going to go to war with China. But if you look at some of the information that's coming out financially, Japan is paying their multinationals or multinational corporations to find other places to set up their factories and get them out of China. US companies are starting to get out of China. So they're going to receive sanctions. But I think economic sanctions are the safest thing.
I have the power in this program to mute everybody.
I saw that. I wonder what you were doing.
The power. Excellent. All right.
I'll just go like this. I'll go like this, and then you know.
All right. So moving along. Of course, we've talked about politicians. We've talked about bureaucrats. Now let's talk about the economy. When on earth is the Canadian economy going to open up? And maybe we should start by looking at some of the examples around the world. We've talked before the show about the very different approach that's being taken right now in Sweden. Might be successful. We're not, I guess we don't really know yet, but I don't know. Thoughts? news? Real news?
I think the jury's still out on Sweden. They're still getting a lot of infections, a lot of deaths.
Yeah.
Late last week, on Friday, Thursday or so, most of the Western European countries said lockdown continues for another 3 weeks. So that'll put them into end of May, early June. And I think Canada and the United States are about 2 weeks behind where the Europe is. So I think we're looking into late June before anything gets opening up over here.
Deirdre, your thoughts?
Yeah, Sweden is interesting. They've had more deaths than Canada. The number of cases is, it's close. I think they're a little bit less than us case-wise. Yeah, they've only had 14,000 cases. So actually their death toll is higher than Canada's. But
and they have a smaller population.
They do. So right now it's, I guess you can look at that and say whether or not it was a success or not. Singapore is another place that had not imposed restrictions, but in the last week here, they actually had to shut everything down, close schools, because they were losing control of it. So,
well, it's a city state too, right? It was always exceptional because they had, everybody's well connected. They've got technology. This one city, not a country like Canada that's spread out like crazy.
Right.
So it's just always a different animal than the rest of the world too, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's really interesting to watch because BC is starting to talk about they've passed their peak. Now, the thing too is that the first case in BC was January the 29th, and Alberta's first case wasn't identified till March 6th. So they are a full month ahead of where we're going to be. But this came up actually at Dr. Dina's press conference. The economic update, oil and gas. What is Ottawa giving us? How are we spending our money? And then COVID update. During that portion, someone had asked Dr. Hinshaw whether or not, how it might affect Alberta if BC starts to lessen their restrictions. And have you heard anything, Paul, being in BC? Because I'm actually not watching the BC press conferences, but are you hearing anything about potential closing of the border, not allowing people to go back and forth? Because that's apparently a worry. Like we're not expected to peak until the end of May. So our cases are still spreading pretty easily in Alberta. BC doesn't want us running back and forth across the border, I'm sure. So have you heard anything about that? Dr. Dina kind of said, we'll keep in contact with other health professionals and we'll make decisions as other provinces make decisions, but I foresee
most traffic in Canada is north-south, right? There's communities obviously along the border of Alberta and British Columbia. We're not going to stop somebody from going from Golden to Banff or something, right? I hope.
No, not from BC to Alberta.
Constitutional. I mean, one of the less recognized part of the charter is the guaranteed right to travel between provinces. Mm-hmm. To take away that right, you require the enactment of the Emergencies Act, which is essentially the renamed War Measures Act. Yeah. So unless the War Measures Act in place, they can't stop you from crossing provincial boundaries. And it would just make no sense, especially, I guess, the most densely populated provincial border is the greater capital area, Ottawa, Hull, Aylmer. That's a huge area. And although it'd be kind of nice if you stopped it, because then the federal government would effectively shut down.
Japan also went back to more of a lockdown situation, and they had appeared to have mostly dodged it, and they had another sort of spike up as well over the last week.
Well, what's funny, British
Columbia closes, or British Columbia opens up, and Alberta doesn't. You're going to have thousands of infected Albertans driving to BC just so they can play golf.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and that's going to be happening every weekend.
Well, and I think we need to be realistic about what opening up means, right? I don't think any jurisdiction, including for that matter, if Donald Trump has his way, the United States, I don't think any jurisdiction is just going to, well, maybe Florida, is going to just
beaches are open,
turn everything back on tomorrow. I think there, and even Donald Trump's plan included a staged reintroduction of things within the economy, with all the double checks and everything happening at every stage, just in case that stage was a step too far, they can take a step back. And so I think I don't think we're going to get back to normal anytime in the next 6 months, but we may get back to a more normal, economy where there's more activity, and that's I think the bigger question is, how does that happen? Is it going to be golf courses? I mean, there are golf courses open in British Columbia.
Yeah, they didn't shut them all down.
No, they didn't. But what they did do was they made it so that the tee-offs were every 45 minutes or something. So space
instead of every 10 minutes. Yeah.
And so, are they spreading disease? Probably not, right? Not in that scenario, but I mean, who knows? Anyway, I think what's to me the most interesting, and Derek, I'll turn it over to you, is people are, we've now been on lockdown for 3-4 weeks, North America, and people are starting to go back to their left-right tribes, and they're broken. The tribes aren't working anymore. I mean, Sweden was the darling of the left, and yet most people on the quote left are all in favor of locking things down. Their heads must be exploding, thinking that Sweden is, keeping things wide open. So, I feel like this pandemic more than anything has really distorted, any notion of tribalism in this sort of left-right paradigm we used to have. But Derek, you haven't commented on the reopening, so I'll turn it over to you on that note.
Well, if you look at if you look at good apples to apples comparisons across countries, the big thing that we see that's flattened the curve has not been total lockdowns of societies, but effective lockdowns of borders early on. So in terms of high numbers of cases, Germany, Spain, the United States, Iran, France, they've actually all gone to roughly the same amount. The point is, the US, Spain, Germany, they all flattened the curve much quicker than Italy or Iran did.
The US has not flattened their curve.
No. Oh, sorry. I should leave America out of that. They have not yet flattened the curve. They're still growing actually quite quickly.
Exponentially.
But those who have flattened the curve and done so at a very low level are Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong. And this is obviously not done yet. And to a lesser extent, South Korea. And they've done it by effectively locking down their borders to at-risk countries coming in very quickly. Now, as Paul said, Singapore is essentially a city-state, so it's got small borders. But it is a wildly, highly, densely populated city-state. So is Hong Kong.
And they just had to shut down.
Yeah, they just did. But even though they did, their numbers are half of what our numbers are. They are very, very low, and their curve has been pretty flat. But Hong Kong and Singapore are extremely concentrated populations. I think Hong Kong, if I'm not mistaken, is the most densely populated country on the planet, perhaps Taiwan. But it's so if it gets into those places, it's game over. Everybody's got it. But they, like South Korea, they lock their borders fast. Hong Kong locked their border fast, even though they're obviously very close to China. I guess we won't mention North Korea, since they're always locked down. But,
and have no cases.
Yeah,
apparently.
Yeah. So Dave had a great story on that.
Yeah, read Dave's story. That was epic. Good job, Dave.
North Korea, the lockdown world champions. But it's primarily been locking down your international borders to at-risk countries that's kept the numbers down. So far, there hasn't been, and we'll probably get a better idea in a few weeks here, maybe sooner, but locking down the entire economy does not seem to be the big difference between this. It's been controlling incoming people from at-risk areas that's been the big difference so far. And when this all settles down, I mean, what I do love about this is Karen, the meme of Karen. Will somebody think of the children woman who's this busybody, always up in everybody's business? She's now become a mainstream figure that people have started to hear about. She's no longer this kind of meme character of the fringe libertarian movement. Has everyone now heard of Karen?
Karen from the internet. That's where I get. She's actually my favorite scientist.
Until a few weeks ago, she was essentially a character of the hard libertarian internet movement, and that was it. And now everybody's heard of Karen. So as the Karens of the world say, you want people to die if you don't believe in totally locking down the economy. If we go on much longer, the lockdown will result in deaths. It's going to exacerbate a lot of mental health issues, addictions issues. In the longer term, it's going to hurt the economy and people will lose homes. When people start losing jobs and losing homes, suicide rates go up. Health problems develop. And so there's going to be a lot of issues in the longer term here that we'll not be able to directly tie to this. But we've got to be we've got to be open to accepting that some deaths are going to be inevitable in reopening the economy, and we can't simply stay shut down for 6 months or a year, because many more people will die indirectly from that.
It's definitely a balancing act, and nobody wants anybody to die from this horrible virus. But you're right,
Karen,
Derek.
you do.
You're right, Derek. There is there's other considerations, and that's, I think, the tough thing for politicians is trying to strike that balance. So we'll see how that.
Don't forget, there's a second wave coming.
Oh, a second, maybe a third. We don't know how the antibodies work. We don't know, if a vaccine's even possible. There's just more unknowns than they don't even know. I checked the CDC website the other day because I thought maybe I did a Karen move by suggesting that maybe warm weather might be a factor. And somebody called me a very bad name on Twitter as a result of insinuating that. And so I went and checked the CDC website, and sure enough, they said they don't know whether or not warm weather. They still don't know.
They have no idea.
Because somebody was on Twitter was comparing Los Angeles to New York, and of course Los Angeles has had a much lower infection rate. And I'd suggested that maybe it was
they also locked down.
Well, they locked down, which was obviously a key factor. But could it all? My point was, could it also be in part weather? Could it also be in part the population density? Could it also be in part the car culture there versus public transit and taxi cabs in New York, right? There's all these factors, but yet the Karens of the internet want to just focus, this is the dogma, and it's if the numbers go down, it's exclusively because of lockdown. There's no other purposes whatsoever. And
I think there's episode Shut Up, Karen.
Anyway, speaking of rules and lockdowns, should our leaders be bound to abide by all the same rules as the rest of us folk, us little guys? Derek, what do you think?
No, they're better. We must trust them and defer to their authority.
All right, then that's the show for today. Thanks. Sorry.
That's all, folks.
That's all.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a tough spot for any leader. They're trying to say what people should do, and then they're expected to be the perfect reflection of that. But I think we have some expectation that they'll live up to it somewhat. I think there was a lot of controversy around after Trudeau's "Don't Speak Moistly" speech, him breaking a lot of the recommendations and rulings he was making about not traveling and whatnot. If you saw pictures even of their press conferences, all the
How
press.
is that even remotely related to speaking moistly?
I said after his Speaking Moistly press conference.
Yeah. Speaking Moistly, by the way, best song ever, I think, of 2020.
Speak
it's
moistly
fantastic.
To me. Yeah. So, but they even had the press all gathered together in these tiny little tents there, whereas most world leaders have had the press all spread out across, doing their own social distancing. But my favorite case was a governor in the United States. I don't want to missay, but Michigan rings a bell. Where there was a governor saying that you can't even go out for haircuts and whatnot. And then she had a particularly nice haircut that day, and the press asked her if she had gotten a haircut, and she meekly admitted that she did, but she did so responsibly, essentially saying that government's able to do things responsibly, but nobody else. But on a bit of a tangential topic, I'm predicting when this all ends, there's going to be a big comeback of the mullet, because the mullet is essentially the natural state of your hair if you just try to trim the sides and nothing else. So there's going to be a big mullet comeback when this is done. So I think that's the big trend for 2020 to watch. If we want to make 2020 any worse, it's going to be the comeback of the mullet.
That'll do it. Dave, you're muted.
I agree with the mullet.
I'm just looking at future options for Derek. And the way he's dressed now, if you just put a white collar on him, wouldn't he be the perfect
Miami Vice
TV priest guy? And failing that, his beard is getting so long now, it could be an extra in Vikings.
You
Well,
know,
actually, if I wear more black, I'd be ZZ Top.
Yes. There we go.
there was a I can't remember, I think it was Andrew Coyne, but it might have been somebody else, wrote a opinion piece in the National Post this week about essentially how the government shouldn't treat people like children. And I think when we talk about the masks, you know, part of the issue, I think in the beginning was, you know, they were afraid people would go out and think that they're safe because they put a mask on, or that they'd go out and buy up all the masks that the medical community needed to buy, you know, and other, you know, people who use them properly, and people can't use them properly. And, you know, there's a lot of that from government where it's like the infantilization of the populace. And I think people are not, don't like to be treated that way. We like to be treated as, you know, whether we are or not, we like to be treated as somewhat intelligent and capable of making, you know, rational decisions and learning things. And I wonder sort of how much a lot of these things that we're kind of faced with is just because the government can't trust us to be smart about doing things in this situation.
Have you seen the people of Florida?
Yeah,
Yeah.
well,
Like there's a really good reason.
Crowded, right?
Yeah, there's a really good reason why people are like, and the thing is, you're only as strong as your weakest link, right? You know, my whole thing with that collectivist society versus individual society, or individualist society, is that, you know, what happened. Do you remember? I don't remember what basketball player that was, but the guy who was apparently tested positive for COVID, he was giving a press conference, and what did he do before he left? He rubbed all of the equipment. Oh, like but that, like, that's your weakest link. That guy apparently didn't understand that his purposeful, you know, contamination of things could actually kill somebody. That's your weakest link. So, you know, why do they have to explain, you know, a mask is not going to keep you safe? Because the majority of masks you can get won't.
Well, I think
right?
there's a difference between smart proper information and guidelines for people. And I think where Paul is going with this is overkill restrictions meant to deal with the lowest common denominator idiot. It's the same reason we have syntaxes on things.
It's the same reason we have warning labels that say "do not operate while sleeping."
coffee is hot.
Yeah,
somebody
I'm
did
a bit
it.
more of a Darwinian. I think if you operate heavy machinery while you're sleeping, I think the human race might be better for it. But but the problem is when you take the, you know, essentially if we're talking about the hyper nanny state, where the government is going to ban people from doing otherwise safe things because a few idiots might do something, it's going to breed some disrespect for these rules in the long term. If this goes on for 6 months, or God forbid longer, people are going to start questioning if they're being told the truth by the government, and people who would otherwise be responsible are going to stop believing in them. So I think the importance of having reasonable restrictions and honest, straightforward information is important, because when everything is catered toward preventing the lowest common denominator idiot from doing something, people who are smarter than that will eventually catch on and stop listening to what the government's saying. And
Which is smart. How?
Pardon?
How does that make them smarter than the lowest common denominator?
Trust this problem, Deirdre, is you don't trust what they're telling you. You don't. If all they're telling you is you know, you have to follow these 600 rules, and you figure out that a few of them actually they're only telling you that because they think you're too much of an idiot to do that thing properly. You're gonna know which rules to trust. You're just
So,
gonna
like,
think
it's
the
It's
government's
all of
just
them.
So right now, even the camping seasons are not planned to be open. And there's not much that's safer to do outside of your house right now than to go camping.
unless you go to your neighbor and you start rubbing them.
Yeah. So, so what they're doing if with this kind of overkill is a lot of otherwise responsible and rational people are going to say that the government's full of shit. And so I think that should be more straightforward with people about what is reasonable and needs to be done here, rather than draconian measures that people are going to start, I think, very quickly, if not already, not taking seriously because they don't trust what's coming from the governments.
Yeah, and I should say, I should be really clear about this, Deirdre. I've been locked in my house for 5 weeks. I'm not going anywhere. But I totally understand when the government loses people's trust because they're not treating them respectfully and they're not giving them, the right information because they're afraid that they're not going to be able to make good decisions. I think that's going to create a problem for people, and there's going to be blowback. And I think that's in the middle of a pandemic. That's exactly the opposite outcome that you really want to have happen, right? That's all I'm saying. I think they need to be open. They need to be honest. They need to be transparent. And at the end of the day, the idiot that goes to the beach for spring break in Florida, he's not watching the hour-long, broadcasts from the public health officers every day anyway, right?
No.
So if we had a little more honesty in media and a little more honesty from our public officials, I think that would build a lot more trust, and we could all get over this thing a whole lot faster.
Yeah.
And I think the best break that Canada's got is the weather, mainly across the country, has been pretty lousy for the last month or so. But now it's starting to get warm. Sun's actually out in Calgary, so it's going to be harder for people to stay inside.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, like if you look at where we moved from a public health recommendation to this is now a law. I mean, look at I remember when Shandro was very specific in his tweet saying, this is not a recommendation, this is law. And that's where we moved from, right? They put out recommendations. They still found that people weren't following them. So what did they have to do? They had to make greater restrictions. Mm-hmm. And it's like, I get how it's difficult. And a lot of people look at it and say, well, this isn't fair. I act responsibly. We're only as strong as our weakest link. And unfortunately, our weakest links, they're weak.
Yeah, and I think some of that is ignorance, and some of that is a misunderstanding of individualism, right? Yeah. And the collectivists amongst us will say, clearly we need just stronger government to give us rules, in the nanny state and stuff. And I think people like Derek, and maybe to a lesser degree myself, who are more of a libertarian bent, we recognize the importance of individual liberty and stuff, but always that has been paired with personal responsibility. And you can't have liberty without responsibility. Yeah. And when you're talking about a global pandemic, should the government take away your liberty? No, but you as an individual have a responsibility not to spread the pandemic. And I think that message has been lost on a lot of selfish people who just haven't stopped to think about what's going on.
The answer is to punch everyone who coughs on you.
With gloves.
And then don't forget to wash your hands.
Yes. Punch them with boxing gloves.
And grow a mullet. And next week's show, we're going to have Best Mullet Contest. Am I right?
Maybe we could put a filter on here. We could put a filter on the screen here, and we can all have mullets.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect.
This is a fresh haircut. It's not going to go mullet.
Did you do it yourself?
Of course I did it myself.
Oh.
No, it looks very good. My wife cut her hair herself, and she did a very good job. I'm not going to touch mine because it'll be a mullet. I just know it.
I'm pretty sure my wife is hoarding hair dye, but I don't want to call her out.
Mine just seems to fall out naturally, so.
Yeah, good job on that, Paul. Good job.
Well, thanks,
I don't
everybody.
want to call her out by putting it on the internet.
All right. On that note, the note of hairstyles, thank you for joining us this week. If you're not a member of the Western Standard, please go to thewesternstandardonline.com and become a member today. like, subscribe, and do all those great things with this video as well. Share it with your friends. And we'll see everybody next week. Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Well, everybody.